Hello and welcome to the Child Psych podcast. My name is Tammy and I'm a registered psychologist. I am a registered play therapist, the co-founder of the Institute of Child Psychology, and I'm a mom to three amazing kids. And today we are going to be discussing anxiety and under the context of a new-ish documentary. It was released in 2022 called Anxious Nation. And we are with the writer, producer, and co-director, Laura Morton. And so we're going to talk all about this very eye-opening, riveting documentary that I just finished watching and could not get enough of. Everyone needs to see this who has a teenager, a child who is struggling. I think you should just watch it if you're a parent in general. If you you're happy with our podcast, you find this valuable, please go to icphelps.com and give us a rating, give us a review. It really helps spread information about our organization and just helps us out a lot. So please do that. Now we have Laura Morton with us. Again, she is the writer, producer, and co-director of this documentary, Anxious Nation. This film has been featured in the New York Times, Psychology Today, People, NPR, Nightline, Movie Guide, amongst others. There are more. She's been involved in the entertainment industry for more than 25 years, written over, I believe this is correct, 60 books, 21 New York Times bestsellers. She's a producer, speaker, and entrepreneur. And she is also a parent of the anxious daughter whose name is it Savvy?
Sevi.
Sevi.
Yes.
And yeah, so just well done. Like it's just welcome and well done. That's all I can say.
Thank you. I'm humbled by your introduction. Thank you. The film actually came out in 2023. We started on our film festival run in 2022, and
Okay.
we had a really extensive film festival run and did well and won lots of awards and decided to launch the film last May for Mental Health Awareness Month. And that garnered so much attention for our movie, which is, I think, a barometer for where we are these days, with dealing with anxiety. And I think whether you're a parent with a child who is struggling with anxiety, or you yourself are struggling with anxiety, or even a grandparent who's trying to really understand what their grandchildren are going through because it's so different for them. And we have found that the film has been just a great help to so many people who are really looking to, one, understand what all of this is about, why we're in crisis, and two, what we can do about it. How can we harness that anxious energy and use it for good? So thank you so much for having me today.
Yeah, of course. And I captured a screenshot of this at the beginning of the documentary, it's right towards the beginning. It says 3 decades ago, the gravest public health threats to teens in the US came from binge drinking, drunk driving, teenage pregnancy, and smoking. These have since fallen sharply, replaced by new public health concerns, soaring rates of mental health disorders. And I know suicide amongst them is incredibly high and just continues to rise. And I know one of the biggest questions parents and professionals and grandparents, other than like what do I do, is where the hell is this coming from? Like, what is this explosion? And it often starts with anxiety. Usually depression is often secondary. I always say that usually you see some anxiety and then comes the depression. There's actually a lot of comorbidity there. So we're going to talk about, which your documentary hits the nail on the head in several different areas, which thank goodness. I'm glad it's not just one. You guys go lots of different ways. But I think before we go there, I want to hear about what your inspiration, because you were obviously inspired to make something like this, and you can just tell a lot of heart has gone into making this.
Thank you. Well, my inspiration is my daughter, and I'm a single mom who from the earliest age, I would say around the age of 3, my daughter was struggling with anxiety, and I didn't really understand it. I'm not really sure that I identified it as anxiety. In fact, it took 7 years for someone to tell me that's what we were dealing with. I took her to the pediatrician, and they would say, oh, maybe it's her diet. Maybe it's, she's got, fears, or it's just age appropriate, or, but nobody really wanted to give it this label of, your daughter's dealing with anxiety. If I had one more doctor tell me that my daughter needed more fiber in her diet, like that was just so frustrating to me because I knew it wasn't her diet. And yet so many of us just we're so busy. We rely on whatever the pediatrician tells us, and that's that. And I had taken my daughter to a number of therapists over the years trying to figure out what she was struggling with and why. And I would say there was a day in like late 2017, 2018, somewhere in there, where I was sitting at my desk and I was feeling completely defeated as a parent. I felt like I was failing miserably. I didn't, it seemed like whatever I was trying to do with her, nothing was getting better. She wasn't getting better. The situation wasn't getting better. If anything, her triggers were constantly changing and I never really knew what I was going to be dealing with. And I just, was at my desk, just head down. And I decided to put one line on Facebook: kids and anxiety, who's dealing with it. Now, this was like 2018, right? So we weren't talking about it like we're talking about it now. This is pre-pandemic. And I was shocked because I thought what was going on in our home was only going on in our home. But it turned out that so many people responded. And it wasn't just the Facebook responses of I am, we are, my granddaughter is, my niece is, whatever it is. I started to get private messages, Tammy. And those private messages were coming from people that I knew and I knew well, and we socialized. And I had never heard their stories. I had never heard them talk about one of their kids attempting suicide. I had never heard them talk about the struggles they were having. And so I felt like, as a storyteller by trade, I felt like there was something here that I needed to unpack and understand, because I knew if our family was struggling, I could not imagine how other families were getting through this. And so I set off on this journey to explore anxiety, the crisis that we were already experiencing. And I say that it, was in the United States, and the US is the most anxious nation on the planet. I think that there may be Israel and Ukraine might have something over on us these days, but in general, per capita, we are the most anxious nation on the planet. And I think it's not an isolated situation. It isn't just happening in the US. And if you saw at the end of the film, we used this brilliant artwork in the film. And at the end of the film, you saw that we curated that artwork from kids from all over the world. This is something that's happening all over the world. And it doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care where you live, doesn't care if you're rich or poor, black or white, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, it does not matter. Anxiety is an equal opportunity offender. And I wanted to understand why we're more anxious. I wanted to understand what we can do about it, right? And so that's what the culmination of our film Anxious Nation really entails.
Yeah. And what I loved is it gave you such I think a holistic approach, which we try at the Institute to honor, that every child and every family story is unique. And what might be impacting one child isn't necessarily going to be the other child's story. And so as parents, and it's just like a storyteller, like you weave together your child's narrative and their world and how they're experiencing their environment and how they're experiencing the parent. And it's we can't look at every teen and being like, you're anxious because of social media. Like, definitely doesn't help, but that's not going to be every teen. My teen doesn't even have social media. So, if she gets anxious, we're probably not going to look at that, right? We might look, and I think we'll delve into some of the topics that you hit on,
Sure.
But I think it's important for parents. Like, we're going to maybe talk a little bit about some of the surprises and some of the things that you came up with, some of the puzzle pieces you put together while making this documentary. But I want parents to know that just because we mention a puzzle piece doesn't mean that it applies to your child. You have to put this together and really excavate what's gone on in your home and the systems that your child lives in. And it's not going to be a one size fits all, just like treatment's never a one size fits all approach. So I just want to make that
disclaimer. The words right out of my mouth. It is not a one size fits all problem. Therefore, it's not a one size fits all solution. And people want it to be. They want to put it in a box.
Of course they do.
Right. And so two things I want to mention in the film. There's two things that I think are really important that tie into what you're saying. One, on average, it takes families 2 to 8 years to seek help. That means they don't know what they're dealing with, or they don't know how to deal with it, right? And two, it's an analogy that Dr. Harold Koplowitz gives, and that is if your child has a rash, that you're going to put cortisone cream on that rash. And if that rash doesn't clear up in a couple of days, you're going to the pediatrician's office. And if the rash doesn't clear up in a week, you're in a dermatologist's office. And it's because we can see it. And we treat a rash with more seriousness than we do our children's mental health. And I think it's so important to understand that health is, it's systemic, right? It is above the neck and below the neck are still health. And I think we have to treat it exactly the same. And I think for so long, especially in our country, in the United States, we have kicked that can over and over and over for decades. And we're so far behind now, where the demand for help and the demand for resources is so high and so great. And we simply cannot meet that demand. So I think it's really important. We can't blame it just on the parents. We can't blame it on the schools. We can't blame it on social media. We can't blame it on the doctors. We can't blame it on the system. We can't blame it on the insurance companies, because it's a culmination of all those things.
Yeah, there has to be accountability in all the different areas. And um, I think at this point, what we can chalk it down to is the culture we live in isn't supporting children's mental health, the culture in
Right.
which we are raising our children. And that
Stop. Like,
sometimes can
and
be,
stop. You got it. 200%.
yeah, it's culture.
Yeah.
And I think parents need to understand that our kids are, of course, raised in the more general, broad culture, of course, within the school system, their extracurriculars, their friends, of course. But then we also have a lot of influence in the microculture of our families. And so I always tell parents, if we can start there, because you often can't control what goes on. We had a global pandemic. You had no control over that. You can't control if your child gets befriended or gets unfriended by somebody. There's things we just simply cannot control, but we have influence into making headway here within that microculture of our families. And so that is where we have some influence with our kids. And that's what I really love. And it's done in very diplomatic, non-shaming way, which I appreciated how you recorded this, is that there is some accountability on parents in terms of how we interact with our kids, that we have to excavate a little bit, that sometimes we inadvertently add gasoline to the fire here. We don't mean to at all, but there are things that we can do to not necessarily cure this. I mean, anxiety is it's a normal emotion, but there are things we can do to help children not stay camped out in this all day. So
Well,
it's so
and not to
debilitating.
feel this sense of permanence around it, right? This isn't
Mm.
not, it does not define you. It's not who you are. You are not your anxiety. And so from our point of view, and I love that your insight into the film by design. Listen, I didn't set out to tell the family story and look at our role as parents and what do we contribute. That's the story that told itself to me in going out and trying to figure out, because I thought I was doing all the right things. I thought I was a great mom. My daughter, I was taking her to therapy, and I was trying to get her help and trying to solve the problem and doing all the things from a pure place of love. And as it turned out, I was actually fueling the fire, to your point, right? And continue to. I'm not perfect, but I've learned a lot. Now my daughter will throw in my face. My daughter's almost 16, and she'll say, for somebody that made a film about anxiety, you know nothing about anxiety.
I have a 16-year-old too.
So you got it. Yeah.
I do. And
Yeah.
they like to call you on your bullshit, which is,
Yeah.
sorry for
Totally.
the colorful
and she's
language,
right.
but they,
Yeah, she's right sometimes, because sometimes I revert back to my old ways. But this is such a important point that I think your listeners need to hear over and over and over again. And that is that you can't just treat the child, right? You have to treat the environment, the family, and you see it so often. Look, you're a professional. I'm not. I'm just, a parent. But so often you see it when parents, you have one parent who is a tough love parent, and then you have another parent who, as we call it, is working for the cult leader, right? The cult leader is anxiety. The cult leader is not your child, it's anxiety. What role does that play in everyday decisions in your home? So you've got one that's really nurturing the anxiety, and you've got another parent who's like, what are you doing? And then they don't come together, and really the person who pays the deepest price for that is that child. And then,
absolutely.
you may have another child who's not suffering from anxiety, in the same ways or at all, like, another child. So I think that the family has to be treated systemically. And I think to learn behaviors that are consistent, that are not fueling the fire, they're not pouring gasoline, or on that already burning inferno. So that was a big aha for me. That was a huge lesson for me. And I think one thing that Anxious Nation did in making the film, and certainly watching it numerous times, it's given my daughter and I a common language. It gives
Mm.
us the ability to be able to communicate on the same page when we're talking about this. And that's a gift in and of itself.
Yeah, I know I have, so context, I have a 16-year-old daughter and a 10-year-old daughter. My son's 7 and not nearly as sensitive as his sisters are. It's just a temperament thing. And we do talk about, you talk about that in the documentary. Like some kids come into this world with a very sensitive disposition. That is genetic. And then when adversity strikes, there could be a death in the family, a global pandemic, the school maybe isn't a good fit for that child. It brings on that genetic, that disposition they had because of their sensitivity. It turns on an anxiety disorder or OCD or whatever it is they're struggling with. And so, I've got 2 kids that are going to be more susceptible than the other one is. Just, I can see it. Their temperament is simply more sensitive. So, honestly, after watching this, I'm like, guess what we're going to be watching during family movie night one of these nights? Like, maybe I think the 10-year-old could take some stuff from it, but for sure the 16-year-old, just to
Yeah.
normalize. Because what I love about this documentary, and this is why I'm like, everybody needs to watch this, is there are so many teens who get on there, and some tweens as well, not like super littles, but they come on and they just share their story. And our kids, it's one thing for adults to normalize. Like, it is very helpful for adults to say, like, anxiety is normal, and I have struggled with anxiety, and anxiety is something that all human beings have, and we just need to form a relationship with it. It is another to see their peers who are their equals saying, this sucks for me, this is my reality, this is how hard school is, this is how hard it is to be on my phone and see the likes and or the unfriends or not get enough followers. And that is where I thought it was so well done.
Thank
Was
you.
it appeals to both the parents, but also makes it accessible for teenagers, especially your tweens and teens.
Well, if COVID gave us any gift, it was the ability to catch a lot of that in real time, right? We were filming. We
Mm.
had cameras out in the field, and our kids, kids are used to filming themselves anyway. They make TikToks and they make,
Mhm.
and whatever they do, right? And snaps. And so we knew our kids would have an easier time recording themselves in the privacy of their bedroom or at home or wherever they wanted to do it, as opposed to setting up this large camera setup and making it daunting for them. And our kids, I thought, were really amazing and courageous to put themselves out there in the way that they did. And I think several of our parents are also incredibly vulnerable and open, and um, I think will make a lot of parents squirm a little bit in discomfort because we're watching things that typically we wouldn't have a bird's eye view of.
No. Yeah, there was some heartbreaking stuff in there, but I so appreciate the parents' vulnerability to let us into their world. And it's some of it's graphic, but it's so needed to see, like, just to see the struggle that some parents, that they feel like they're drowning. And if
I felt that way.
anything, yeah.
I felt that way, and I had the ability to get my daughter in to see someone. I have health insurance. I have the ability to pick up the phone and get to whoever I need to, and I felt that way. And you asked me at the beginning of this interview, what was my inspiration? My daughter, first and foremost. Secondly, was I needed help, and if I needed help, I knew that what we put together, we could push out into the world. And if it helped me, it would help a lot of people. And that was really the inspiration, right?
Mm.
How do we take that anxious energy? How do we harness it and repurpose it and make it work for us and not to us?
Yeah. So you mentioned a little earlier, and I saw that, especially I was reviewing some of the documentary this morning, was, kids, parents aren't maybe getting ahead of this, like they'll put it off, being like, oh, this is just normal behavior, or like, oh, I don't know if I want to, they're slow maybe to the draw to get supports for their kids.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's just to err on the side of caution, I'm saying, and just like check it out, like get educated, take a course, read a book, find a
Watch this
therapist,
movie.
watch a movie, right? And just to see, like, that might be my child. So that was one of the things, is maybe there's still shame associated with mental health, just not
So much.
education, just maybe uncomfortability with having hard conversations with our kids. That was something that, like, really came up for me. What I loved, like, where I just was like, yes, was one of the things you really unveil is how social media impacts our kids. And this is like so important to talk about because we live in this world where our teens are constantly competitive and always comparing based on beauty standards, comparing on likes, followers. Like there's this constant social comparison. And I don't know what, maybe you can share a little bit about like what you took from that. Cause to me, I was like,
So first, I want to
yes.
say that the statistics around social media are alarming. And while I think that social media is a contributor, I don't think it's the pure cause. I think a lot of people will point their finger because it's something like that rash. It's something easy to point the finger at and go, well, there's the problem. And I do think that there are some good things that can come from social media. But overall, what I really think about social media is that it's shaping our children's lives in really alarming ways, right? It's disconnecting them from reality and distorting their perception of what it means to be human. That
Mhm.
connection, right? It promotes entitlement. It promotes instant gratification, comparison. It's eroding the resilience and the ability to cope with hardship. It's time, I think, that we have to take a step back and ask ourselves, what's that balance, right? Slow down, and how do we reconnect and create deeper, more meaningful relationships? You know, my daughter and her friends could be sitting in her room together. I'm sure you see this with
Ugh.
your daughter, right? And literally they're just on their phones. They're not even talking to each other, but they could be texting and they're sitting in the same room together. So I think what we have to do is learn how to prioritize real life connections and experiences over the superficiality of this virtual world, right? And it's
Yeah.
only getting worse because social media is turning into, you know, virtual reality and AI and, you know, all the things that are coming down the pike. And here in the United States, tech is not regulated, right? So big pharma is regulated, tobacco is regulated, but tech is not regulated. And in fact, tech here in the United States is protected under an article, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which says that those tech companies cannot be held responsible, liable, culpable for any third party posting on their platforms. And I think
Mhm.
that we have to hold the tech companies to a higher standard because every statistic in our film, so you saw the statistics that popped
Yeah.
up, came from an internal study at Meta. So there's no denying what they know. There's no denying the damage that they're doing and continue to do by design, right? So they create these algorithms that are designed to keep you addicted and scrolling and take you down the rabbit hole. And, you know, it's not enough. It's not enough that they're doing to protect our children. And by the way, a lot of adults have the same issue.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say this is not overuse of devices and social media platforms.
Scrolling,
Adults,
rabbit
absolutely,
holes. Yeah.
and just disconnecting from our kids and from our lives, and just being, just observing our life passing by rather than partaking in it. I think Dan Siegel, and we know Dan, we've worked with him. He said, uh, and this is for our teens especially, like belonging is so important for teens, that they have true, authentic, connected relationships. That belonging for the mind is like breathing for the body. And when our teens are just on a device and they're not partaking in vulnerable conversations and spending time, engaged in activities together, that it's superficial. It's, yeah, you're sharing space with each other, and it doesn't mean they can't have some of that, but often it just falls flat because we weren't designed to just communicate through a device. We're
Well,
designed to make eye contact and smile and engage in shared mutual activities together.
and try explaining that to a teenager today because they think you're from Mars when you try to explain that, right? But for me, I think what's so important is we have to look beyond just the anxiety and depression, right? What is really at the core of this? And it's that loneliness, that isolation.
Mm-hmm.
And that I think is also a very universal crisis.
Yeah.
And I think that these are all offshoots of that. And, you know, when we, generations, behind us always had a place where they gathered, where they got together, where they connected, where they could shake someone's hand, where they could look each other in the eyes. And, our kids just don't have that anymore. And my generation, we were social. We went roller discoing and that was where you went on a Friday night. But, the kids just don't do stuff like that anymore. They don't connect and they don't know how to connect. And that's even more problematic because then you're sending these kids out into the world. They go off to college And so many of them are not equipped, and they fall apart, and they fall apart fast,
Yeah.
right?
Well, we need that social glue. And when we think about anxiety is systemic issue, it's not just our kids. Like this is adults too. Like we're all anxious. And
Totally.
I would say like anxiety is contagious. Emotions are meant to be felt by the tribe. And when you've got adults who are in charge of the tribe are a mess. And then we wonder, we're like, well, of course the kids are anxious too. That's not the only reason, but it's a piece of the puzzle there is being like when we are disconnected and adults are dysregulated and then we expect our kids to manage their feelings when we can't manage ours. It's like the blind leading the blind. I'm like
Oh my God,
we're
you have this so right. Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah.
we have to model emotion regulation and we have to make friends with our own anxiety. And I know you had the author of Anxious Parents, Anxious Kids, and I'm forgetting her name right now, but she wrote a really incredible book and you interviewed her on your documentary. And she speaks to that a lot. Like there's this piece where we
Lynn
have to
Lyons, yeah. Lynn, who
the
I think is
lions.
phenomenal in this film.
Yes, she does.
Yeah.
And she was a very influential, like Shafali's work in there. You had Dan in there. And yeah, but that's something just to consider. It's not the only reason. And that's why I think I love your work is you're not trying to shame parents. It's just like we just have to be open to where the root is.
Well, let me share something with you. So, your listeners will not have seen the film yet, but I'll set it up. There is a scene where a mother and daughter are sitting on a sofa together, and the mother is talking to the daughter about what she would be doing. I can see the look on your face, right?
Oh,
And
yeah.
yeah, and it's a cringeworthy scene.
Oh, uncomfortable. I
And
turned it off and I had to turn it back on. I was
yes,
like,
and when during our film festival run, it was audible in the movie theaters where people would act, they would gasp, and out loud they would say, "Ugh, that woman! Ugh, what kind of mother is she?" And yet, that scene is one of the most pivotal and important scenes in the film because it happens in a lot of variations, right? It happens with parents, pushing their kids academically. It happens with parents pushing their kids into sports, and having to be high performance. And what is amazing about that scene, though, and I want to share this with you, is I went to the mother and I said, "Hey, there's this scene. I think we should take it out because I don't want to crucify you. I don't want you to be the most hated mother in America." And I showed her the scene and she said, "No, no." She said, "I want you to leave it in." Yeah.
wow.
And she said, "Here's why. I know who I am as a parent and I know where I mess up and I know where I make mistakes and I'm not perfect. And that pursuit of perfection," and she says this at the end of the film, is the wrong pursuit, right? We're not perfect parents. We're never going to be perfect parents. We can try to do better. And she said, "If you leave that scene in the film, it will induce enough conversation among families so that they can do better."
Wow. What courage that took for her.
Amazing, right?
Amazing. Because so our audience, I just want to really be clear. This film is being featured at our summit coming up in April. And then for those of you who can't come, which is fine, we'll have a link to anxiousnation.com in the description of this podcast. But it's about halfway through the documentary, this scene we're talking about, and this is where this mom has all these wishes and hopes for her daughter's acting career or musical auditions. She's doing something in the entertainment industry, I think. And the mom talks about her ambitions at that age and, her nailing the auditions. And you can just see she's living vicariously through her daughter in that moment. And she's being very vulnerable with her daughter and very honest, but you can just see, I'm sure later she has this aha moment like, oh my God, like I'm putting all of my feelings of inadequacy and shortcomings onto my kid and pushing her so damn hard she's not feeling good enough. And that's kind of like the essence of the scene. And I'm
And that's what I
sure
mean. We see it like if your kids play sports, you see it in like the dad on the sideline of the soccer field or the baseball field, or we see it with parents who really push their kids academically. We see it all the time. It shows up in many different ways. The courage that it took for her to allow us to keep that scene in with the inspiration that someone once said to me, "If you don't like the reflection in the mirror, don't break the mirror. Change the reflection." Right. And that is a giant mirror that has been held up for a lot of people watching this film that they have to take a step back. I guarantee you, because I've gotten letters from people who've watched the film who said, I was sort of quiet about it. And then on the way home, I turned to my husband and said, do I do that? Or, and we had the most important conversation we had had in years. So the idea is not to shame. The idea is not to say, you're doing it all wrong. The idea is to say, look, this is something that we can work on, so that we have to work on it for ourselves first and foremost, but we also don't want to pass this on to our children. We don't want to be the vessel that takes our own stuff, right, and makes it our children's stuff.
Absolutely. And I think it's a neat thing because we talked about social media and disconnection. And for our teens, we're in this constant, the teens are comparing and comparing and competing. Parents are doing this same damn thing.
For
And
sure.
Kim Payne talks about this, Kim John Payne, who we work with regularly. He talks about the parental arms race, where everyone is trying to get their kid ahead and they're trying to get them in all the sports and getting all the grades and all this. And then we miss the child. We're living through them to give them the flying head start, but sometimes we miss the forest through the trees.
Well,
And
that was a big aha for me, I have to say, because not that I wasn't putting pressure on my child, but I wanted to give her more than I had, right?
yes.
And I think that's a very natural thing. If you're able to do that, I think it's a very natural progression. What my biggest aha, and I say it at the end of the film, is that I had to learn to let Sevi be who she is and not who I want her to be.
Mm-hmm.
And that was such a big breakthrough for our relationship. It was a breakthrough for her anxiety. It was a breakthrough in allowing her to just grow into who she is. And so I think so often we see our kids, and Shafali talks a lot about this in conscious parenting, right? So often we see our kids as an extension of us.
Yes.
When in fact, they're individuals. And they have to become who they are. And, yes, they inherit certain things from us, but we can cultivate, it's gardening, right? We can cultivate that garden in a certain way. If we want to grow roses, that's what we grow. But, that isn't always in the kid's best interest. Some kids are born and they're going to be great athletes, or they can play the piano like a prodigy, right? And some kids are not. And that's okay. And, so that was a huge thing for me to understand. I had my daughter through in vitro, and I had an anonymous donor. So there was this 50%, factor that I didn't, I knew enough about the donor, but there were things that I could look at my daughter's hands and go, those are my hands. I look at her feet and go, not my feet. But when it came to things that she was struggling with and her emotional, her EQ, if you will, there were a lot of things I just didn't recognize. And that was on me. I needed to do better. And, making this film, first of all, it put me in the room with some of the greatest experts that are in this lane. And I got to ask them anything I wanted to ask them, which was so great. But I also got to take that content and information and push it out into the world and give it to parents who need it so desperately.
Beautiful. Yeah. So I think with that point, just kind of completing that full circle, as parents kind of have this, either it's not feeling good enough or worried their kids won't get everything that they need, or they need an edge because we want to save them from pain, or we want them to get a good job, or all of these things, gives that child the essence of, I'm not good enough. Like, you don't value me for who I am. And at the root of it is a parent feeling maybe not good enough, or having a lot of underlying anxiety about like their child's life turning out okay. And it really blinds that parent to a child's true essence, and that child doesn't feel seen and heard. And we bridge it back to social media, that if one of the issues with social media is social comparison, our parents end up comparing their child to other kids, or they're parenting with another parent's parenting. And I know I had this the other day, my husband and I had this conversation, this exact conversation. And one of the things I subscribe to with my kids is I don't put them in a lot of activities. Like, we're very careful not to overschedule our kids. We want them to be kids and have family time, and that's really important. But I said to him, sometimes I just feel like we're not doing enough. Like, and I'm like, and I am a psychologist who studies this stuff. And I'm like, no, I know like at the essence that having my kids at home and doing lots of family movie nights and them playing and connecting and going on walks is actually really good for them. But then I see all of my friends on social media doing all of these like high-end sports and their kids are getting all these accolades. And I have decided as a family culture that we're not going to subscribe to all of that, some of it, but not all of it. And here I feel like I'm just failing as a parent because my kid, and I'm like, that's my stuff. But even when you know better, you still feel that way as a parent.
Oh, completely. I mean, and that's why, to hear you say that is so, in so many ways, it sort of validates how I was feeling, right? And I'm not a professional. And, I feel like we do that comparison is difficult. And I don't know if you saw this, I'm sure you did because it went viral, but did you see the video that Julia Roberts put out? She was sitting with her niece, Emma Roberts, and it was like a Saturday morning, no makeup, and they were just playing cards. And the comments that after posting that video, the comments were cruel. They were brutal.
Oh, no, I
And
heard about it, but I didn't see it.
yeah, and Julia Roberts, came around to this notion like I'm a grown woman and it hurt my feelings. Like what is this doing to a 15-year-old? And so I think it's so important that look, we have to figure out what is right for us. We started off the conversation by saying it's not a one size fits all, right? And it's not. So, some kids actually really excel in being pushed into sports because it gives their anxiety a place to move, right?
Mm-hmm.
It gives their anxiety a place to be repurposed. And we have the young man in our film who's the basketball player. That's exactly what basketball did for him.
Mm-hmm.
And he was able to take that energy and just leave it all out on the basketball court. And, we see it all the time with musicians. Cooper, the young girl that we were just talking about, just signed a record deal with the music manager who took Taylor Swift from country to pop. Like she's chasing her dream, and she's a super anxious kid. She has a high level of OCD, and she's taking that and she's pouring it into her songwriting.
Yeah.
And we see it in the art that we display in the film. So there's all sorts of ways that we can take that energy. That's why our tagline for Anxious Nation is harnessing anxious energy for good, and and repurpose it. So what is good for your kids is good for your kids, and there's no judgment if you're a parent that's pushed your kid into athletics, if they're happy, if they're excelling, if they're right.
Yes.
Look at
Yes.
Andre Agassi is a great example of somebody who hated playing tennis, hated it.
Hated it. Yeah, and I think as a psychologist who sees teens in their office with parents aren't listening, I think that's something just to be very, very cognizant of. Is that this is it's often a theme I see with teens, is that yes, I know there's benefits to sports. We talk about the research, we talk about organized activities, and yes, when kids get to a certain age, it's over the age of 10, by the way, these things are good. But I think it sometimes can undermine that child's true gifts when we decide what those gifts are. Like when we say you have to do this, and the message is if you don't do this, you don't belong in our family. You fall short. And so always keeping, and I have teens who won't drop out of soccer. They won't drop out of playing guitar because they said, if I do, my parents will be disappointed. And basically I don't belong to them anymore.
Right.
And that's just, again, just one of the ways in which anxiety can kind of rear its head with kids. And I see that, look, it's a little more angsty energy that teens have and they don't know who they are then because they're just living this parent's idea, this idea that parents have projected onto their kids, assuming they're doing it from a very good, generous place of giving their child, it's expensive to put your kids in these things. Of course it isn't. It takes time and energy, but we kind of, sometimes we miss our kids.
Right? We project, and that projection comes from a pure place of love, but it also sometimes does more harm. And Shefali, again, this is definitely something that Shefali talks about so brilliantly in the film. But it is really becoming a conscious parent, becoming aware of our own actions. And when I first started to make the film in 2018, the original question was, are we more anxious or are we just more aware of it? And in 2024, I think it's a moot question, right? I think we are clearly more anxious. But I wanted to understand, a lot of people just thought that maybe there was just sort of this media hype pushing us into this crisis, and that's not the case at all. But I really wanted to understand anxiety in a diverse way, not just cultural diversity. And there's tremendous cultural diversity when it comes to mental health, but there's diversity in the way that anxiety shows up. And if you're dealing with an anxious child, the likelihood is you're also dealing with the understanding that anxiety is a shapeshifter. So what made your kid anxious a week ago might not be an issue anymore, but now there's a new issue. And I always felt like sometimes I would walk in the door and I felt like anxiety like was waiting for me with a giant 2x4, just going to clobber me. And what's going to be the drama today? And I could never quite figure it out. And all I really wanted to do was help my daughter feel better. And I actually just said, make my daughter feel better. And that was probably true in the time. Right.
You gotta make it happen.
Yeah, but now I understand. What I wanted to do was help her, and I wasn't equipped. I didn't have the tools. I didn't have the language. I didn't have the skill set. I had to develop that for myself as a parent so that I could help her better than saying, don't worry, I'll handle it. Oh, you don't want to go to school today? Don't worry about that.
Right? Yeah, we have a whole podcast that talks, and we're going to be interviewing other clinicians. We're kind of doing this series on anxiety that talk about that, but it's really good for parents to educate yourself, being like, whether it's a course with us or a book, or, I really like anything by Eli Leibovitz. I like Lynn, Anxious Parents, Anxious Kids, or Anxious Kids, Anxious Parents. Lynn, please help me with her name. Lynn Lyons. Her stuff is amazing. We have a good course in anxiety, but parents we just need to learn to, instead of react to their anxiety, we learn to respond to it in helpful ways and give kids the skill set. So when they go out into the world, they don't need to fall apart all the time, but normalizing that, yeah, it's there and we have anxiety and this is the cards we've been dealt, but we can do X, Y, and Z with this. We can find healthy ways to cope with this and put that energy somewhere. And kind of like, I want to just kind of be real about this as somebody who had unreal amounts of anxiety as a child, like debilitating, like hair pulling, chewed on my nails, panic attacks, school avoidance, depression, suicidality. Like it was bad as a kid. Wow. And this is why I'm now a mental health therapist. And this is why I do this. I put all of my energy into understanding myself and putting myself into therapy and learning about child development and saying, if I can prevent it, I don't want another child to feel that way or to feel misunderstood in that. And so I just want parents to know that just if your child is really struggling, like you can find ways and to divert that energy, to use it in healthy ways. And your kids they'll be okay. It just sometimes takes time and understanding. And there are so many different ways to adapt to this. And it's not the here all end all. Their life's not over because they have anxiety. Yeah, they can do really amazing things with it.
A lot of really successful people have high levels of anxiety. Mm-hmm. So, it's true. And they thrive off of it. But it also can be very debilitating. I think what's so important for families to know is that in general, when you're dealing with an anxious child, you're just putting out fires, and what's so important is to get to the arsonist. What's causing those fires?
Yeah. Chase the why.
What was that?
Dr. Dan Siegel says you chase the why first. Yeah. Chase the why.
Yeah, 100%. And, and I think that it's true for all of us, by the way, right? Even as an adult, you go to therapy and in general, you're just like, oh, here's what's going on today. But like kind of, looking back and connecting dots and what is the root cause of all of that. So I think it's very helpful if you can give your kid that gift early on in life. Their odds of going out into the world and thriving and not feeling defined by, their anxiety or their OCD or whatever it is that they're dealing with, but feeling like they can actually succeed because of it, not in spite of it. Right?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this inspiring message and letting all of our listeners know we will be premiering this at our summit We've already got upwards, I think, of 6,000 people attending it. So a lot of people are going to have access to this documentary. And you can go to our icphelps.com to register for our summit. But if you're like, yeah, that's not for me, I don't want to go to your summit, check out anxiousnation.com and watch the darn documentary. Just if you could watch it with your teen, especially if you have a teen, I really think struggling with this, with any kind of mental health, I think there are so many aha moments there that will inspire your teen just to feel seen, being like, I'm not the only one dealing with this. Like, this is a shared experience by so many people around the world.
And hearing it from the kids, my daughter has become a mental health youth advocate, and she's working with Born This Way, and she's working with UCLA. And as a teenage girl, it's a really vulnerable time. And the idea that she's putting herself out there, like all the kids in our film are putting themselves out there in such a way, they all had the same reason. And the reason was, if their story can help other kids feel seen and heard, then it would have been worth it.
Mm-hmm.
And the diversity in the stories and the backgrounds is really significant, and it shows you, and there was something you and I were talking about early on in this conversation. It really shows you that anxiety, does not impact us all in the same way. But I'm so thankful that, one, that you took the time to watch our film, and two, that you're sharing it with your friends and colleagues in your summit. I think that's fantastic. We're really thrilled to be a part of it. And again, if anybody wants to stream the film, anxiousnation.com, it'll tell you where and how. And, thank you for having us.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. This is a really important subject, and I just hope there are some aha moments there for parents, because it's so raw, and which is why I think they're going to remember it. They're going to have something to really hold on to, which I think we need. There's all this digital media coming at us. We're naturally storytellers. And so when you watch a documentary like this, it's going to stick with you versus maybe reading it in a book.
Yeah, it's
Book,
an hour
there's a
and a
place
half,
for it.
right? It's an hour and a half. But if you have to watch it in chunks, watch it in chunks. And, for some parents, and I want to acknowledge this, it'll be a hard watch, right? Because it's so close to home. So it pokes the bear a little bit. Don't not watch it. As parents, we have a responsibility to have the hard conversations and, and to do hard things so that we can understand as a family what we're going through. Yeah. So watch it in chunks, watch it in one sitting. I highly recommend, just getting cozy and having an open mind, and I think you'll get a lot out of it. We consistently hear from people, you're a professional, this is your world. And you told me before we started recording how much you got out of it.
Yeah. I love how visceral it is. Like, to me, it's so emotional, and it just captures. So it normalizes. I think that's the biggest thing for me, I think of as a parent watching this, if I didn't have the background, it would be like, oh, you too. That's how my teen might be experiencing this. Like, oh my gosh.
Or you recognize behaviors that you didn't realize, right? And that's so important. We've actually had people watch the film who honestly did not understand that they had anxiety until they watched this film. Adults, parents, right?
Yeah.
And didn't realize they had an anxious childhood, and watched this and went, wait a minute, that was my childhood. But what's so important to know is the last 30 minutes of the film is all about hope. So you got to get through kind of, here's what the problem is, here's why. And, here are things you can do about it right now.
And here's how. There's some pathways.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I look forward to everybody either streaming this on Apple. I know I'm in Canada, so I went through Apple. But Prime also carries it in the US. But there's all those different options on anxiousnation.com. Go there, and then you can see the different pathways to access it. Or if you are a part of our summit, you will have access to it there as well. So thank you so much. It was riveting. I love it. Everyone watch it. It's incredible.
Thanks, Tammy. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Have a great summit.
Yes,
all right.
thanks.
Bye.